and change it. Okay. All right. So once again, welcome everybody. And thank you again to Steff and Jo for making your time available to us today. SATA is very, I think we're this small organization that we feel like we're at the bottom end of Africa, and yet we feel really heartwarmed when we get to connect with people from around the globe. So thank you again for that. And I will hand over to Marguerite, who's our vice chair, to introduce you.
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, let me give you some details about the lovely Steff and Jo. So starting with Steff. Steff is a TSTA in psychotherapy. She lives and runs a small psychotherapy and supervision practice in mid-Wales. She's a visiting trainer to a number of TA establishments in the UK and Europe, and has written numerous articles in the TAJ and the Script. Her passion has been to integrate TA and various other modalities to bring an understanding to psychological problems that are not so easily brought into a coherent narrative. She's just ended a 6-year position as Vice President Research and Innovation for the ITAA, and I've had the pleasure of working with her on the board. She has co-authored a book with Diana Deacon, charting the evolution of TA psychotherapy and offering a critique of theory and methodology. And the book is due to be published in 2025, so watch the space. And then we have Jo, who is a PSTA based in Manchester, north of England, works as the therapist, supervisor, and trainer with a strong interest in trauma, neurodiversity, and work with the body. Her main modality is TA, but Jo has trained in complex developmental trauma and dissociation and is currently undertaking additional training in family constellations. She's passionate about the intersection of therapy, politics, and culture, and established a TA neurodiversity network, a Facebook group that has over 600 members. So welcome to both of you, and thank you so much for doing this presentation for the South African TA Association.
Thank you, Marguerite. That's a very nice welcome. It's very strange to hear people introducing you, isn't it? I'm thinking, who's that? Is that me?
Who's that rather esteemed colleague of mine, Steff, is where I went to. It's a very lovely introduction. Thank you very much. Thank you, Marguerite. Thank you, Andrew. Shall I move to the presentation? Shall I bring it up, or would you like, do you think it might help, Steff, if we just, it's up to you. Would you like us to begin with the presentation, Steff, or shall we just begin with a kind of general discussion about what people might want?
Yeah, I mean, we've added that to the presentation, but given it's such a small number, I think it would be better to start with that before.
That's what I was wondering, because we are very small. So what we got really curious today when we were talking about, because this is a presentation that we've done before. It's a workshop that we've done that we then wrote a paper about. But we got really interested that rather than come and present to you, we also wanted to have dialogue with you. Like, what's important to you about this topic? What was the interest in us coming here? And what is it that you might really want to be able to ask that maybe you might be a bit afraid to ask or might not know about? Or like we really wanted to kind of have an open conversation with you about what happens when we start to talk about being start to talk about neurodiversity and what it might mean to be neurodivergent. So would that be okay as a kind of opener?
I think so. I think also to add to what Jo's just said, our understanding of this process of neurodiversity and neurodivergence is continually evolving. So there may be things that you guys know that we have yet to learn. So I feel like a very mutual learning space that from each other.
Yeah.
So does anything come to mind from each or any of you as in response to Jo?
Yeah.
Hi.
Mm.
I actually got curious when I saw the title. My I'm okay, you're okay might be different from yours. I think something like that. And I really liked that because I thought, yeah, it might be different from yours.
Mm.
So I was curious about that. And I'm here basically really to learn and broaden my perspective. I worked in the past with a client who had autism and with a client who disclosed that she had ADHD. And this was something that came up in the sessions, so I didn't know beforehand. And my work experience with them was really very positive. But I thought, yeah, why not learn more? Maybe there's something I don't know. I'm just curious whether there is something I would learn today that I didn't know before that would be helpful.
Okay. That's lovely, Rawia, and that really kind of helps. Because again, we were really curious about what people knew and didn't know and where to begin and where to take the conversation. So it's really helpful for me to hear that this is something that's live, that there's an awareness for you, and that this is work that's already happening, and that this is a kind of opportunity to kind of think together really about what this might mean. Okay, lovely, thank you.
Think together and dig deeper, I often think.
Oh, I like that. I like that.
Because some of what we're presenting, I think, is instinctive. That we're presenting, you might have already thought about and been working with Ravia. So yeah, it's interesting to dig deeper.
I think for me, what would be, sorry.
You go.
I think I don't know if I'm on the right page, but for me, what would be interesting would be not to be assuming and to perhaps ask better questions, not assuming that we are understanding things in exactly the same way.
Okay, I've over recent years, the more I've worked with people, the more I've begun to wonder whether neurodiversity isn't more common than neuronormal, whatever that means.
Yeah. Lovely.
There seem to be so many variations, and I haven't worked directly with people who have been diagnosed with some neurodiversity, and I've wondered whether they perhaps should be. We've worked as we have, wondering when some kind of tests are useful, when not, when there's a diagnosis useful, when not, that kind of question. But I've worked with a number of clients whose children have been diagnosed with either ADHD or autism or various variations, and even how those variations are decided there seems to be so many open questions still. So I'm really curious, very much wanting to learn, and yeah, that's me.
Lovely.
That's lovely, Diane. Certainly my path into becoming curious about this was very much through both my children, both of whom the older one, who's now 22, was diagnosed as autistic when he was about 9. And then my younger son was then diagnosed when he was about 11 or 12, and they're both wildly different. And that's part of it, you know. So it's a very interesting thing. And then of course that became a kind of question for me. Well, if that's my children, who am I, and what did I not know about me? So that's also been part of the journey for me too.
Thank you.
Yes, and I think, Diane, you were there when I was kind of coming public about my ADHD diagnosis. So I remember a conference with you in Birmingham, and feeling very tentative about how public to talk about this and what it might look. I just the welcome you gave me actually, which was really quite important. So yeah.
I remember that moment and remember thinking, wow, this is courage and this is good.
Then welcome, Mary.
Hi, Mary.
Hello, hi. Thank you.
Hi.
Sorry I'm late, just working, but here I am. You want my expectations. I'm terribly interested in this topic. I'm just dyslexic, and both my children, one is ADD, the other one is ADHD. So I've had to, I mean, they're both like they have children. So I've been maneuvering this territory my entire life. But I'm also terribly interested in neuroscience and have done quite a lot of studying in that. So anyway, I'm looking forward to hearing from both of you. I really am. It's just right up my alley.
Great. Oh, and Mary, feel free to share any neuroscience you understand about things, because we're saying this is a mutual learning space. Yep. So we're really up for that kind of input.
Great.
Lovely.
Great. Oh, I'm thrilled. That's great.
Shall I put the presentation up then, Steph?
That's a good idea.
Let me do that. Okay, let's see. Okay, is that the right view? Can people see? Or do I need...
we got you.
Okay. Okay, so over to you then, Steph, if you want to introduce the presentation.
I always feel a bit naughty about this title because we stole it from Judith Matrani, who wrote a book entitled Ordinary People, Extraordinary Protections. I believe that she's a Kleinian psychoanalyst, but she wrote the most beautiful, sensitive book around helping people, find a coherent narrative when the narrative isn't available. So it's a very beautiful book that touches on autism, I think, more than other neurodiversions. But I really recommend the book, and we stole her title, hoping that she'll do this. And our subtitle is Neurodivergence and TA in the Therapy Room.
Lovely.
I think we've had introduction, so I don't think we need to say anything more about Jo or I, so we'll move on to the next slide.
Okay. I'm a little bit struggling with what I can see and what I can't see, so I'll maybe anyway let's keep going, but I may need to change the way that the slide is formatted. Can I just ask, actually, because I think one of the things that Steff and I are learning is that we really need to kind of walk the walk as well as talk the talk. So before we begin, this is a very standard kind of presentation so we ask you to think about yourself in terms of self-protection, think about the limits of what you want to share. We want to invite you into this mutual learning space. And very much kind of say this is just a kind of whistle stop. We're taking this huge topic and we're attempting to condense it into something that kind of makes sense to people. So there's a lot going on in this, and we ask you to take care of yourself. And at the same time, we also want to ask something like this, like, are there adjustments, accommodations? Are there things that we need to do for you that might help you to participate in this space in a different kind of way? And this is what we mean about kind of walking the walk. So I'm going to give you an example from my practice room. So most of my clients are neurodivergent, and if they didn't know that they were at the beginning, most of them now know that they are. The kind of things that happen in my practice room are things like a client who says to me, I cannot bear the ticking of your clock. Yeah, can you take that clock out of the room? And then I made the mistake one time and bought a second clock. So there were two clocks ticking in a room, and she found it unbearable. The sound of my heater is unbearable to her. So there's something very interesting about when we start to really think about what might be required, both from us relationally, but from us in terms of what we offer and how we kind of curate spaces for people to enter. So do people need to work with the Zoom image off? Do people need to have some accommodations about hearing? Do people need anything really that would help them kind of participate in the space? So there may not be. We're quite a small group, but sometimes in a big group, or certainly in a physical space when we've worked, with a different colleague, when we've asked that question before about what would make this space support you and enable you rather than disable you, we've had all kinds of reactions, including very sweetly, people who've needed to stand up at the back and move so that as they're moving, it helps them to think and process differently. We had somebody in a workshop who really needed to sit outside the group and participate in that way. And we had somebody last time who sat under a table, and she had a great deal of fun doing it. And it was really, anyway, it was a joyful thing for her to be given permission to do something differently with her body and with her form of processing. So I'm just going to check in case there is a response from anybody, in case there is anything that we could do to accommodate you. No? That's great. Okay, lovely.
If we were in a physical space, I would probably, if anybody was wearing strong perfume or you were lighting joss sticks, I would have to ask you to stop probably.
Diane, that's absolutely lovely. And I've had somebody contact me before now and say, when I come into your office, can you do something about any kind of sensory overwhelm? And smell in particular was really important to this client. Yeah. I really love what you're saying. That there's this really helpful principle, I think, about, you know, do our spaces support people? Are there hidden disabilities here that we need to take into account? If the more that we start to think about sensory regulation, might we do things differently? Like I remember when you bought a weighted blanket, Steff. Yeah, we were in a supervision group and this weighted blanket was shared round by people. Everybody was like having different reactions to it. But there's something very important sometimes about us really thinking about the space. Okay. So moving on. I think we've done that. There was a question for both of us about culture. I got really curious about South African culture, about even the idea of neurodiversity, what it means. And I don't know if that's something that we might want to attend to as we go through this. Unless anybody's got anything you want to speak of now. No. Okay, I'll move on. But I just thought we wanted to kind of register it and see whether or not it becomes pertinent to what starts to unfold here. Okay. Oh, can you read that? I can't read it.
How confident are you in assessing for that one?
Yeah. For some reason, maybe it's because of my screen. So I'm just checking with other people's screen what visual you've got and whether you can see it.
It's very clear for me.
That's fine.
Very clear. Yeah.
So do you want to take this bit, Steff?
I think a lot of it's been covered in the introduction, actually, but one of the questions that we wanted to ask was, how confident are you in assessing for? And we differentiated that from diagnosing neurodivergence in your therapy room. So we wanted you to really ask yourselves, oh, yes, I'm really quite okay with that. I can, extend my understanding, so I feel quite skilled in that. Or, oh, actually, I need to learn a lot more, so I'm a little skilled in that. Or actually, I've no idea what you're talking about. So we were really just wanting to assess where people were at in terms of familiarity and what they...
Sorry, Steff and Jo, what do you really mean exactly by assessing? I'm not quite sure that I understand the question.
I think we mean taking account of, really. So I was thinking, as Jo was talking about her clients who couldn't bear the ticking clock or who wouldn't want perfume, I remember in my early TA training days that actually that was probably seen as something that a client should have to manage, really, or that it would be made into a therapeutic issue of passivity or agitation or escalation. No, I think we're really talking about accounting for difference. We're talking about when we mean assessing. To answer your question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm going to move on, Steff. Yeah. Okay. So we thought we might just, I can't read some of it, but I can remember some of it.
I lead on it, Jo.
What's that?
Can I lead on it?
Yes, lead on it, and I'll add if I need to add anything. Yeah.
So we wanted to just really state where we're at this particular moment, and that changes as things change. So we're still learning about neurodivergence and neurodiversity, neurodivergence, and neurotypicality. Mean by these terms. So as Jo and I were talking this morning, we were talking about our thoughts constantly changing, actually, in that, you know, we start to wonder, oh, is there anybody out there who's neurotypical? We all have different brains. We're all very, very unique. So there is no typical brain, but sometimes people like to differentiate between people who have a more typical brain and people who have a more divergent brain.
And I think what I'd add is because mostly these are, there's a very lovely idea from somebody called Devon Price, who is an autistic scholar. And they kind of argue that maybe neurotypicality is a cultural standard nobody can achieve. Yeah, maybe it's beyond all of us, actually. And at the same time, there is this kind of tension, and we'll talk a bit more about it, because the tension is there's an idea that says neurodiversity is like biodiversity, everybody's different. But if you're not careful with that, you can end up down the line of, well, everybody's a little bit autistic. And actually that's heard by many people in autistic community as an enormous discount of their deeply difficult experiences at times, and for some people a disabling experience. So there's something about holding these two concepts and noticing the tension between them. So when Steff will talk more about neurodiversity in a minute, and neurodivergence is a kind of political term, and a term that's really held in autistic community as meaning so divergent from this typical norm that there are such differences in processing, thinking, feeling, organizing oneself in relationship to the world, that you are definitely that you kind of fit a different category. Yeah. So when we use these terms, neurodiversity is like the umbrella term, and then neurodivergence means that you belong to a certain kind of community. You are autistic or ADHD or dyslexic, or so it's used in that kind of way. Okay, over to you, Steff.
Sounds grand. So we're basing this workshop, as Jo has just said, on the principles of the neurodiversity movement, which began as a social justice campaign for acceptance and inclusion. And in one sense, we're all working with neurodivergence, whether we know it or not. Studies show that about 20% of the population are different neurotypes, and that they may be overrepresented in our therapy rooms, both as clients and practitioners. I remember somebody in the last place I lived asked me, oh, so what kind of clients do you work with? And I always find that difficult to answer. And in the end, I ended up saying to him, I think mostly I work with people who've been misunderstood. I think that's where I first go. And then when I've been delving more into neurodiversity and neurodivergence, I can see that actually that there are a lot of neurodivergent people who've been misunderstood, misrepresented. And as Jo has said, there are many other neurodivergent therapists and trainers beginning to have this important conversation. And we're inviting you guys to join in with us in that conversation.
Lovely stuff.
Thank you.
Okay. So these were the kind of takeaways that we wanted when we first did this workshop. This was what we were really keen for people to walk away with. And Steph's just been talking about them then about people feeling misunderstood, misrepresented. And there's tons of quite painful stereotypes out there about the limits of people. So a classic was always things like autistic people don't have empathy, which is just so hurtful and wonky and wrong. So there's these, we can talk some more about that if you want us to elaborate on it, but there's these kind of old ideas that are still hanging around that impact our kind of sense of who we're talking about and what we're talking about. So we think there's been lots of this misunderstanding and misrepresentation has contributed to a lot of masking. So maybe your clients may not know that they are neurodivergent because they've always been trying to fit in. And they've always been trying to work hard at trying to be some normative idea of themselves. And one of the things that leads to, of course, is a kind of injury to the self. If the self that's you is not welcome, and then you're spending your time trying to be somebody that you're not, it's going to cause all kinds of psychological trouble for you. So we really wanted to kind of, we really wanted to invite people to be thoughtful about what they're bringing with them as kind of misconceptions and stereotyped ideas, and whether they're true or not.
Can I ask,
yeah,
are we talking about a neurodiverse belonging to a specific community? Is it fair that we actually have continuums going? And it is easy to think in black and white terms, and sometimes it's borderline. Would it not be?
I think, Rowena, there are continuums everywhere. Yeah, everything's about grades. I'm kind of reluctant to use the word spectrum because it's been a bit misunderstood, but there is that idea that, of course, there's just this endless kind of configuration of what it is that makes you you. Yeah. And
so we still need to look at the person individually, because their manifestation and the experience of it may be unique.
Well, that's such a beautiful point, because that's totally what we want to say. Every single person is unique. And whilst we've accounted that psychologically, because we account it as the kind of story of how you became you, what we haven't done is begun to also understand it neurologically too. And I think that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring both in. Yeah. Okay.
And in answer to your question about the black and white thinking, and Jo and I have just written an article on what's psychological and what's neurological, because we're trying to really understand what is as a result of the way that we've been brought up, or how we might think script or protocol, and then actually what are the things that are fundamentally a part of how my brain functions, and they intersect, and so when you use the word borderline, I thought, gosh, if you've spent years really being understood or misunderstood, in some ways that's going to lead to an escalation of this is why I am. So the rise in energy or agitation, I think, can often be misdiagnosed as psychologically pathological when there are other things going on. So that's partly what Jo and passionately advocate.
And complex. Yes, really complex. And I love your question, Rowena. And it's very much this idea about how do we expand our theory. It's not about saying that our theory isn't relevant. It's deeply relevant. But how do we expand it and include this idea of a different body mind, like a different neurobiological base? Yeah. Okay.
Could you say something more about the term spectrum and why you're avoiding it?
Oh, okay. Only that, Diane, that typically when most people, certainly what I would think if somebody says the word spectrum, it seems to imply like a kind of A to Z kind of line like this. And then sometimes people have added ideas around it of, well, this is, they've used terms like functioning, like low functioning or high functioning. Yeah. So sometimes it's been misused in that way. The most, again, from within the autistic community who are brilliant these days at self-advocacy, there's much more of this idea about taking chunks of, if you imagine more like a circle, yeah, and in that circle there are lots of different aspects of it, like nervous system regulation, sensory system difficulties, communication difficulties, and kind of seeing that each person may have something happening in all these different segments of the circle is how the spectrum is kind of represented these days. And some of it is an attempt to get away from this idea of functionality, because otherwise functionality has been imposed from a normative place again. So the person who doesn't speak, yeah, is kind of seen as low functioning, and it's a distressing way to start to talk about somebody's experience. So that's been the pushback against the word spectrum, really. Okay. Yeah.
There was one wonderful TV program in the, I don't know whether it's further, where Chris Packham, an autistic guy and a TV presenter, made a wonderful program of the mind of the autistic person, and actually got somebody who was a non-speaking autistic person to actually choose a voice actor that would speak the own voice of the thoughts that were going around in his head, even though he was mute. And it was such a moving program that the thoughts that this autistic young man was having were just so beautifully poetic and coherent, and it was wonderful. It just blew me away, actually, that program. But I don't know how widely accessible it is, but
okay,
that's an example of where the spectrum wouldn't.
You've just reminded me though, Steph, do you remember The Reason I Jump? The book by the Japanese, Japanese boy who used a kind of certain form of, I forgot what it's called, like a communication device. It's the most beautiful poetic book this young man has written. Anyway, and that's quite widely available. And there's a film. It's called The Reason I Jump. Okay, over to you, Steph.
Okay, I've been wondering whether our presentation was actually made for people in the psychotherapy or counselling field, but actually I think it applies to all four fields, really. So even though I'm talking about a client maybe coming in for psychological help, I'd like you to think of what I'm reading in whichever area of TA you're applying your. And let me know if it works or it doesn't work. Okay. So I'm just going to read you a story, and you can close your eyes if you would like to, but you don't need to. So just for a moment, I want you to engage in a rather ridiculous fantasy. Imagine all transactional analysts are beautiful smelling roses. Let's say that roses are the most autonomous, healthy flower in the world. All transactional analysts have been to Rose University to help others to be roses. Why wouldn't everyone want to be the most autonomous, healthy flower in the world. So one day a sunflower walks into your office. Does the sunflower need to grow smaller in order to be healthy or autonomous and be the same size as a rose? Or if a forget-me-not walks in, does it need to grow bigger in order to be like the rose? Does a lily need to grow more petals in order to be like the rose? Of course not. Autonomy, something we value highly in TA, does not mean there is a fixed form. There is no way to be, and there is no model to which we need to keep adjusting ourselves to or others to. Rather liked that little story that was in one of the books on autism that I read. A moment to think about assumptions about what is health, what needs changing or doesn't need changing as we work with our clients.
Every time we do it, I stop and think
I was thinking,
and go, yeah, it's lovely.
I was thinking about that little logo that you've got for the neurodiversity network that has change at the centre. And of course, change is the focus of TA, really. And I was thinking that these might want to change the expansion, like I find more of my different self rather than change who I am.
Find more of your sunflower there.
May I ask a question here? Because when I read this, I think to myself that this is to us perhaps if one misunderstands what in TA autonomy means, then you would the sunflower might need to grow smaller or adapt in order to be like the roses. But autonomy in TA is exactly about the opposite of that. I mean, Eric Burns' description of autonomy being able to see the coffee pot and hear the birds sing in one's own way and not the way we were taught speaks to me directly to the issue of divergence and difference and diversity, and of us being enabled to step up and say, I'm not like what I was taught. I'm not like you, and I'm not like what I was told I'm supposed to be. I am autonomous of those things. So for me, and I just think that's what interests me about being here, was to see, when I read the description, where TA for me, I think TA lends itself to issues of neurodivergence and diversity, and doesn't, and not the opposite.
Yeah, I would be inclined to agree with you, Marguerite. And I think that the way that some people have taken up TA, like in my journey of writing the book about the history of TA, it's been phenomenal to me how with every successful theory, in some ways, it becomes rather kind of doctored, or it's a bit like religion in some ways. The fundamental people come on and
thinking the same thing.
This is the way to do that. A friend of mine, when she was in training, wrote a lovely little pamphlet of not okay things to say in TA. It just made us laugh. So as a final presentation. So
I'd love to see that.
We've lost it now, but it was like, don't say true, because that means you're, determined not to get there. And so I think there are ways that the theory that in some way become more doctrinal. And that's what I was wanting to challenge in this, really.
Nice. Thanks for that, Steff. Yeah, I think that's really meaningful and important in our work. And that dogmatism can become the problem.
Jo pointed out to me this morning that some British people have just written an article in our local magazine. That they think Eric Byrne was autistic, which has actually been my view for a long time. But you know, of course, we can't die Eric Byrne because he's not here. That would that what you've just said about the coffee pot and the roses, like I Eric Byrne was a very sensate oriented man and brilliant.
And wonderful at decoding social situations so that we could begin to understand the implicit rules, which is just a lovely thing to be able to offer. It's a great thing to be able to offer.
Exactly.
The other thing I might add about that word doctrine and dogmatism, I think you said dogmatism, doctrinal, was I think what's also interesting is that sometimes clients arrive with their own internal doctrine of I should be like this. And I think so there is sort of something very interesting, I think, about how we hold the space out for people to become the selves that they are rather than the selves they think they need to be. And I do think that's the trickiness about often for neurodivergent clients who have a strong history of masking. They come to therapy and they are asking for things that actually are quite harmful. You know, help me become like this rose, help me become like this. And that's where, again, this very interesting idea of what do we mean by autonomy? What is it our task is with somebody is very interesting.
So I went to therapy to help me feel less. Didn't work. Thank goodness.
Yeah. Thank you for all the times it didn't work. That's what we have to say sometimes. Okay, lovely.
In average life, autonomy would be, the distinction would be, can this person function independently or not? Ordinarily, wouldn't it? Can they meet the life goals, the normal life goals, the traditional life goals? That would be most people's understanding in terms of reading autonomy, would it not? And then it linked to what you were saying is functioning. Can this person function independently would be the way most people would deal with that.
You're spot on, Rowena, and I'm about to talk about something next where this is part of the problem, because you're right. I think they begin to kind of sound like functionality. So okay, so I'll just go to the next slide, but I'd like to answer what you said. It's a really important question. So part of the difficulty really is about living in a normative culture that maybe does not welcome or respect aspects of neurodivergence. So this whole idea really is, you know, we live in a social world and there is very strong argument still about what creates the kind of desired, the desired normal way to be. And we thought it was really important that what we also talk about is this idea of social trauma. Like, what's it like to be in a world where maybe you don't feel like you're ever going to be good enough, or that the things that you do to process, regulate, think, the things that you do to live your life are seen as problematic. And that's the thing where then some people then end up in therapy with a fix me desire, you know, help me be different so that I can do this thing. No, you know, what's that, Steph?
It's not normal to want to sit under a table at a workshop.
Yeah.
That's where you learn.
Yeah. It's not normal to need to move your body or to or to process in a way that requires there to be real silence around you, or for there not to be too strong smells. Or so it's this difficult bit about where the person meets their environment, and in a and using the difference really between the kind of old medical model of disability, i.e. the trouble is in you and your body and your mind, like you're the one who is somehow disordered and needs to change to fit in. The social model of disability says, actually, it's about the way in which we relate to our environments and whether or not our environments support us to grow, to learn, to become whoever it is that we innately are. And I think it's a deeply important part of this conversation because, and again, I just keep using therapy as an example, if that's all right. I don't know if people are from different fields, but it's the whole thing again about even just that idea about, is the space that you're offering a space that supports people to feel contained, to regulate, to manage their experience? Because if we get that bit right, then what happens next is okay. What happens next is all of our activity, psychotherapy, counselling, organisational work, onwards. We can, something different can happen, but there's something really important about kind of identifying that. And again, this comes from the world of mostly autistic community, but certainly from ADHD as well, which I have. Like, what's it like to be in an environment that is difficult to manage? And that's adding a kind of load onto somebody already before they've even begun to do whatever it is that they need to do. So there's a strong movement happening about thinking about how out there can change rather than locating all the trouble within the person, because that's a very harmful way for people to grow up. And in neurodivergent circles, we talk about this as a kind of form of ableism. You should be able to do all these things like your peers. You know, for my kids who couldn't manage all kinds of things at school, there is a, you should be able to manage it. Yeah, you should be able to go in these ways and participate with your peers and not get overwhelmed and not have responses that aren't recognizable as ordinary. You know, so there's a lot of pressure to conform to this kind of ideal of an ableist society. And I'll just add this bit in. When Steff and I were writing our paper, one of the concepts we came across that I absolutely loved was this concept from architecture that talked about, actually all of us have only actually got temporarily able bodies. All of us at some point in our lives will have vulnerabilities, disabilities, we'll have things that we can't do anymore. So this architectural idea is, wouldn't it be great if we designed all buildings as though everybody was only temporarily able? Yeah. So that everybody could use whatever space in whatever way. Anyway, so it's I really like the idea of it. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that? I'm going to move on because Steff's got a great example about talking about the psychological impact of ableism. Oh, no, this is something different. Okay, we'll come to that in 1 minute. One of the things Steff and I wanted to do was to start to integrate TA theory with what we were beginning to understand more about in terms of neurodivergence. And one of the things that we landed on was this. So Burns' pile of pennies, which all of us are deeply familiar with. He doesn't have an idealized pile, but we've kind of added that in as a kind of version. So in Burns' idea of this, his idea was that each of these coins was like an ego state unit, he called it, if I remember correctly. And that almost kind of throughout our, at the beginning, he talks about throughout our day, we add our ego state units in, but also as we are growing and becoming. And then he talks about the idea that what happens if we have a traumatic life is that our pile of pennies is likely to be wobbly, is likely to not be able to hold itself together as easily as somebody who's had a more ordinary experience. So we really like that idea and we wanted to add some more things to it. Okay, so we wanted to kind of expand the metaphor and think, what happens if, rather than this question of what happened to you, which is the psychological question we're all used to thinking about in TA, we kind of started to think, what would happen if your beginning coin was a very different kind of coin? So that every ego state unit, every coin on top of that was informed and influenced by having a different kind of body-mind. Yeah. What would happen to your stack? What would it look like? Yeah. What might different stacks of pennies start to look like? So we thought that one of the things we could do with our theory was to start to expand this question. So if we think about all that trauma work that happened from the 60s onwards, that Byrne was very much involved in, so we kind of moved from a what's wrong with you kind of framework for thinking about what was happening to people's well-being. Then we moved into a what happened to you kind of question. It's much more trauma informed and attachment informed. We thought that one of the other questions we're bringing to this is to start to ask people, well, who are you? Yeah, is there something innate in who you are that might need to be accounted in the way that we work with you? And that might be that somebody has neurocognitive differences, some of which, of course, might be that we're born like that. Very interestingly, we could also think about people who are impacted by physical and neurological health conditions later on in life. But if your neurocognitive processing is different, how do we account it? How do we make sense of it? And if I just give you a slight example, I did a workshop recently about thinking. And I thought, we never think about how we think. There's a kind of assumption that we'll think in the same kind of way, or that thinking is this thing that we share as a kind of common, I don't know, but it's a kind of underexplored thing. But we started to get really curious with each other about what do we really mean by thinking, and how do we all think? And what's the fantasy of the normative way of thinking? And what's a different way of thinking? Steff, do you remember, I'm going to share this, but it's something that was said to you about, yeah. Do you want to share that story?
Jo and I were talking about thinking and talking about the really the value that is put on the adult ego state, like get into your adult ego state, or you can feel and think at the same time, those kind of TA edicts that are offered to us. And I remember it was Adrienne Lee actually who said to me in a workshop at one stage, oh, I see how you get to your adult now. You get to your adult through your child ego state. So actually you have to feel things before you think about things. So if we start to say you can feel and think at the same time, that doesn't kind of work for you. You have to go through your feeling to get a clarity of thinking. Very, very useful information for me.
And a brilliant description of bottom-up processing, really, which is what lots of people who are neurodivergent tend to do. So they tend to have much more kind of sensate awareness. And what you might have is a strong sense of kind of an embodied experience way before it kind of travels up and it becomes knowable in a more languaged kind of way. So this whole bottom-up experience is quite a profoundly different way of organising one's experience of oneself and others.
And I was thinking, Jo, about how this really must apply in all applications of TA, really. So we're therapists, but I was thinking in the educational field, in coaching, when you talk architecture, I thought about organizational environments that it's very applicable right the way through all of our.
Yeah. And you are also reminding me, because a few years ago we did a piece of research, didn't we, about the experience of neurodivergent people in our education and training systems. And what was whilst there were some very moving and lovely stories about how people were accommodated and how different ways in which people's differences were kind of met with care and concern and adjustment, there were also some quite tricky stories about how people's form of learning and form of processing was seen as problematic. And And I think in our education and training system is where this turns up a lot.
You're reminding me of the impact that neuro-linguistic programming had on TA at one time, which was quite profound. And also how little it was taken forward. And it's always amazed me how little of the understandings of neuro-linguistic programming ever made it into schools or anywhere else. And that applies across the board, not only for people who are significantly neurodivergent, but for everyone.
Yeah.
And it's back to that idea again of probably if we made things more accessible, more inclusive, more attuned to a wider range of people, probably most people will benefit from it.
Yeah.
Steff, you were speaking about some people who need to start with their child before they can think clearly. And I'm thinking of that Daniel Kahneman book about thinking fast and thinking slow. Is that, do you think that links?
Joe's much more familiar with that book than I am.
Yeah. I love that book, Rowena. And I often think thinking fast and slow fits for me around the difference between system 1, which is fast associative. You know, it's our A1, isn't it? Maybe, or our A0 in TA. But it's implicit, it's unconscious, it's there, it's this very speedy system, but often it's not right. So we might all know the answer to kind of, you know, what's the color of custard, or what's 2 + 2, because we've learnt it in this system 1 way. But actually system 2 is this much more complex bit of thinking that requires executive functions, like it's effortful, you know. So if we had to add what's 264 times 14, we'd all have to probably get a pen and paper out and go, oof, and think about it differently. So I think you're really onto something. And I really like that work, because I kind of go, system 2, this much more effortful, executive function dominated form of thinking is like A2. And for some people, it's much harder to be able to access your A2 in an easy way. I certainly, me and Steff have this in common, but that bottom-up processing means, oh, my A1 is always on. I'm always in that kind of form of associative thinking. But if I have to do more effortful thinking, sometimes I get really stuck. So I have to kind of learn and process a bit differently.
Yeah, and for me, Rowena, I haven't actually read that book, but I'd like to. But for me, I think it was much more of a sensate or kinesthetic way of getting to know what I was thinking. So I often give the example of how I learned to ski. You know, I persisted in my middle name, so I stayed in the beginners class for 12 years. And every year I'd start at the top of the beginners class because I'd done it all before. And every year I'd end up at the bottom of the beginners class. But I could have written a book on how to ski, but I couldn't do it. And then one day, a skiing instructor said, oh, I know what you need to do. And he put his arms around my arms and his legs around my legs and his skis around my skis. And we skied down the mountain. And that year I won the top prize in the ski race because I could suddenly do it. It was like absolute magic. But everything that I knew cognitively about skiing, which was quite a lot because I tried very hard to learn it, wasn't of much use in me getting the actual kinesthetic movement that I needed to learn. So fascinating.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Great question, Rowena.
Oh, Rovia?
Hi. So I'm looking at the slide of who are you, and I really love that question. And what it entails. And it reminds me of a story I had with a client. So normally I work with clients, and if any theories or anything we discuss in the sessions comes up, I often follow it up with an email, maybe an article, a piece of writing for them to read. And I think it was the third or fourth session, and I don't know how, I was discussing something with the client and I said, oh, did you read that thing I sent you, you know? And only then he shares with me that he's dyslexic. And I suddenly thought, oh, and I really realized how uninclusive have been in my sort of assumption that I send articles and they can read it. And then I started thinking, okay, I can share audios, I can share videos. But the thing that came to me in that moment is that how come he didn't share that with me? Was it something from his side that made him hold back? Was it something from my side that I didn't make it sort of comfortable for the client to share? And that's why I like this, who are you, at the beginning, where you can make it safe for a client to really already put something out there that you can account for in your work with them. So I think really it's beautiful. I really love it.
And sometimes people don't know who they are. That's what I've also
Yeah.
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 So, you know, as a question, when I'm kind of met with a, well, I don't know, there are lots of ways that I go about it, probably using NLP, not that I ever trained in NLP, but you know, I will use different ways of getting to know people and, you know, feel different substances or getting them to move or walk around the room, and so that we start to really build a sense of, who am I? This is what I like. This is what I don't like. This is what works. And by the way, I'm trying very, very hard to get the TAJ on podcast. I will do it. It's taking a long time, but it's, you know, for people with dyslexia or people who are, so that they can have access to the articles that. So, yeah.
Can I say something? I am dyslexic, and when I get a screen like this that's full of words, and you're talking at the same time, I find, I mean, I can read, no problem, but I can't read and listen at the same time. So when I give lectures, which I do often, or workshops or whatever, I read my slides exactly as I've written them, assuming that there will be people in the room that might be dyslexic. And it takes me a while. I can read all this. I've written it. I have to write it down at the same time as I'm reading it so that I'm, you know, connecting it. So anyway, just in case that's
Mary,
useful
thank
to
you. That's really helpful to hear. And do you know, you're so right. Like, here's a set of words, and then here's me going off piste and speaking in all kinds of different ways. And actually, you're right. That's a processing difficulty for some people.
Yeah,
and I hadn't thought about it. So thank you. I really appreciate you sharing that with me.
No, I'm not saying that to complain at all.
No. It's got me thinking.
In case it's useful to you to know, this slide has been up on the screen for a while, so I've written it down, I've read it, I'm fine. But the last slide, I didn't. It had a diagram as well as a bunch of words. You know, by the time I get through all of it, thinking about the diagram, what does that mean, reading all the words and listening to you, it's hard for me.
Yeah, we also should have said at the beginning that you send these slides to Andrew, and you will have a copy of them. So there was no need.
Of course you will. Of course you will. That's why I'm not worried about it. I'm just trying to give you that feedback because I am biodiverse or neurodiverse.
Thank you, Mary.
And I'm honestly, no, I'm genuinely grateful for you sharing that, because it's not in my knowing. So of course I've just missed it. But look how easy it is to miss somebody's processing needs. Like, you need it to be like this. And it wasn't like that. And then you have to work extra hard.
Yeah.
You know what happens? I get a knot in my stomach. Every time you turn to the next thing, I go, and I'm so in touch with it. I mean, I'm older than everybody, all of you. And so I've been dealing with this my whole life. And I always know, oh, there's a reading challenge. And I get this, you know, knot in my stomach right at the beginning.
Gosh, yeah.
It's interesting Not in my experience either. So the two of us have been not noticing that, Jo. So it's very useful feedback.
That's really, really, really
I'm curious to know, Mary, would it have been helpful if each line appeared on the screen as the person said it? My husband is very clever with these things, always insists on doing my slides like that. I can't technically do it, but he has a way of just each thing appears as I say it.
Yeah, that's what I do
think
too.
that's very helpful.
I do that too with all my slides. And then I read them. And because you do that, people expect you to read them, and then it makes it easier.
Yeah. Do you know, I'm going to send this presentation either to you, Mary, or to Diane's husband, and we're going to reformat it so that we don't do this to anybody again. That's a great suggestion. I love that.
It is a great suggestion. I forgot that that's what I do, Diane. Thank you.
Okay. Are you okay if I read a bit more then? So I'd like to, and I am somebody, and this is my ADHD process. I read the words, they go in, I think something, and then I've gone off to some other place. So that's the other thing that's happening for me. So these are the differences. So I've said about neurocognitive, sensory processing and sensitivity is often different and deeply important. Somatic differences are very much around nervous systems that are often heightened. So there's likely to be much more dysregulation. And we're going to see that turning up in terms of affect regulation. So often there is great intensity in feeling. And sometimes a lot of shutdown because of that intensity. So when you get difficulties with energy management, like people run out of energy more quickly. And typically that's more autistic than ADHD. Somebody like me, my energy management will just go up and up and up if I'm not careful. So the neurotypes that we've talked about that we think need greater recognition in TA, these neurotypes include autism, ADHD, the highly sensitive person. I think that says dyspraxia. I can't see it because it's hidden on my screen. Dyslexia, sensory processing differences, and synesthesia. And in synesthesia, you get sometimes a constellation of different sensory experiences where some people may end up being able to feel a colour or see a certain day of the week as a colour or a sound. So sensory input and sensory output are different. Okay. Steff, I'm trying to get us, I thought the next slide had been the ableism one, which is the one I really wanted to share with them. If it's not the next one, can I move on to it so that you can talk to it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So let me just see if I can get us to the next slide. So I'm going to, if that's all right, I'm going to move it into this. Is that okay, Steff? Because I think this might be helpful about what people have been bringing.
And we do need to keep an eye on time, actually.
I know.
One of the things we were doing as we linked this to TA was to really look at how these things might come out as impasses, and then how, in a sense, as we all introject our parenting or our culture or things that are coming up growing up, we end up with a kind of internalized ableism. So one of the reasons it took me to about the age of 60, I think 59, I think, to get my ADHD diagnosis was that I just thought I was lazy. In fact, I met up with a recent school friend who I hadn't seen for 50 years and told her about my ADHD diagnosis. And she said, "Oh," she's a very blunt friend, "oh, I just thought you were thick." I just thought, oh, that's a good point. So you know, I'd kind of internalized these messages about myself that I was lazy or not very bright or all of those other things. And these are the kind of internal dialogues I think that I was having really between P2, P1, C1, P0.
Do you want to read them out, Steff? I'm just thinking about what Mary spoke to. Would it?
Yeah, I was going to. I was just
okay. Great.
So you know, at a type 1 impasse, the dilemma inside me was, you know, I'm trying and I just can't do this. I can't organize myself. And then, you know, a parental voice would come in and say, other people don't need this much help. Just concentrate on what you're doing. Slow down, concentrate on what you're doing. You'll be able to get there like other people can. But often that just didn't work for me, especially if it was something that I had to do that didn't engage me. I kind of hyper-focused. When I found TA and psychology, I was much more able to apply myself because there was something that I really loved. So, but then that leads on to a type 2 impasse. Oh, there's something wrong with me and I have to hide it. Because if they really knew how I struggle, they wouldn't stay with me. But from a child, I'm not expecting help. I'm being abandoned if I let people know the struggles that I'm having. There's something wrong with me. And actually, I think even at a somatic P0, C0 level, I am a fraud. I feel useless and a fraud. That's the dilemma between me and myself that's going on all of the time, that I'm internalizing the kind of ableist messages that have come my way. So we thought it would be useful to put that in a TA diagram in terms of what happens in the parent and child dialogue. Add to that, Jo?
Yeah, no, I just think it's a really clear and really potent idea, really, about what might be happening. And once it's been internalized, that kind of ongoing sense of failure and inadequacy is really difficult.
And you know, paradoxically, I think a lot of people who struggle with any kind of neurodivergence actually work extra hard to prove that wrong with them, because actually they're really, you know, kind of like under the water, really, you know, paddling very hard to look. It takes a long time to accept the difference and to accept help.
Yeah. And I think you're making a really important point about somebody talked at the beginning, I think it was Diane, about diagnosis and about when might diagnosis be helpful. And you know, one of the things that often comes up for people is this idea that they've already felt very bad about themselves and already call themselves all kinds of things: lazy, weird, stupid. So then this idea that actually in seeking a diagnosis, that can be a very compassionate and affirming thing to say, I'm not lazy, stupid, weird, and ADHD, I'm autistic, I'm like, there's something much more respectful and hopefully honouring of one's process in that shift. It's been a big thing, hasn't it, for lots of people, about beginning to kind of reclaim their identity, because they're already talking to themselves in a hypercritical way.
I found my school report from when I was 11 a couple of weeks ago, and it said, Stephanie tries hard, but she's careless.
Oh, wow.
Every single subject. I thought, oh my goodness, that's such an ADHD report.
Oh dear.
It'd be very sad for my 11-year-old, but yeah.
And we've got more to do, but I thought, should we check in with everybody's energy or how people are doing?
Yes.
Whether this is enough? Yeah.
We lost.
Okay. Yeah.
I feel as if I need a break from the from the stuff and to see everybody again?
Great. I think that's I'm happy to do that. Shall we come back together as a group?
And then we can come back to it just to reconnect.
Yeah, that's a really lovely idea. Let me do that.
And we might need 5 minutes walk around. We've been going for an hour and 25 minutes, so we might need to shift and have a comfort break.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, Diane, it's such a comfort, isn't it, to come back to people's faces from
Yes. I was getting a bit desperate. It's all very interesting and
enough already. Yeah. And what do you reckon then, Steff? Do people want to stop for 5 minutes, get up, move around, have a comfort break? Shall we stop for 5 minutes? Okay, lovely. Okay.
So reflection. Well, we're together again and seeing each other rather than the big.
Yeah, I wanted to say a little bit more about the diagnosis, because I'm often very wary of diagnoses for clients. But the one area where I've seen with friends and colleagues and where a diagnosis was supremely helpful was with some of the neurodivergencies.
Yeah.
That it really came as, oh, thank goodness. Now I at least know what the hell's going on. Yeah.
I thought that too. And because I didn't know until I was a senior in high school, I realized I was struggling with reading, and I wasn't even really aware of it. And then in university, I started hearing people talking about dyslexia. I didn't know anything about it. So when I finally realized that I was dyslexic, I was so deeply relieved. But I took both my children to have diagnoses, and my son was diagnosed with ADHD. Fine. He just adjusted, and he's, terrific. He suggested. My daughter has never forgiven me, and she's 48. Wow. And she says, you labeled me. And she still goes on and on about it, about the fact that I labeled her as having a brain problem. That's how she expresses it. So it's amazing. I said I only did it because I thought it would help you. If somebody had told me that I was dyslexic, I would have been thrilled, would have made a huge difference. But it's funny how people have a different, accept it or don't accept it.
Yeah. And by way of consolation, I can only say, Mary, that almost everybody I know, a mother has to be blamed by something terrible by her daughter.
Especially your daughter. It's always your daughter.
It's always the daughter.
Oh my God, it's so true.
If it wasn't that, it would be something else.
It'd be something else.
But this confirms everything.
I kept thinking when she had her own children, she'd get over blaming me for everything. But she still falls into it every now and then.
I just confirms.
You're speaking to one who knows.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Ravia? Yeah.
Ravia, go, yeah.
I was just saying that it confirms what Jo and Steff have been sharing with us about the uniqueness of the experience. That we cannot just assume that everybody is the same. That each person, dyslexic, ADHD, autistic, their experience is unique to them.
Absolutely. Beautifully put.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was...
Oh, sorry, after you, Marguerite.
Sorry. Oh, I was thinking about, I was dating a psychoanalyst, psychotherapist a while ago, and he had a colleague, same field, both psychotherapists and then psychoanalysts, and they had a completely different point of view on this. And the one said, he said, you must give the diagnosis, it's such a relief, and so on. And she said, well, they were talking about autism and Asperger's syndrome in particular. And she said she doesn't agree because what she finds is then the person uses that as a, she didn't use the word crutch. I mean, I'm not a psychotherapist, but that's what she was really alluding to. And that she felt that it's not something that you should dive into and give the diagnosis without being really careful of who you're dealing with because of. And it made me think of, and she gave an example of one child who she'd been working with for many years, about 8-9 years. And the parents kept on saying, but she's autistic, she's on the spectrum. Why, shouldn't we tell her what? And she said, no, she will use that to disable herself, so to speak. And then they took the child to someone else, and they got the diagnosis that they were wanting. And what that psychotherapist predicted then started to happen. And then it became, I can't help it, I'm autistic. And I was thinking of that in terms of, just came to mind the game, what's it called? Wooden Leg in TA. So there is that, to be careful before you. And I suppose it depends, it may be different to be diagnosed as a dyslexic or autistic. I don't know if that would make a difference.
I think there's two brilliant things in this conversation. One is that's where we ask about assessing. How do you feel about assessing for it? And the assessment is about you having a expanded frame of reference to think with your client or in what context you're working, but to be thoughtful. But it's not to impose anything. And I have often, the way into these conversations have been things like, have you been curious about your sensitivity in this way? Are you curious about who you are? Are you curious if there's something else happening here? And for people who aren't, we don't have to go there. And I work with adults, so it's different. But it's a conversation about identity and about people's curiosity about owning their identity, and then the work that comes from that is around the reclamation sometimes of that identity. Oh, this is who I am, but it's not an imposition. And I think that's what we all have to be really mindful of. But the last thing I would say is that there's an increasing amount of evidence that talks about post-identity. Often there is a regression for most people, but fascinatingly, the regression sometimes has really strong psychological gains. Yeah, like, I'm going to give up masking, might say this little girl or whoever it was who's diagnosed. I'm tired of trying to make that work in that school. I can't do it. So there may be something here of a kind of, they call it a kind of skill regression, but some of the skills are masking that at some point are going to cause all kinds of psychological harm. In the UK, there are lots of teenage kids who school refuse all the time, and they become school refusers, but at the same time still thinking that they're weird and different, and rather than, oh, you're autistic, and actually the school environment is too noisy, too loud. There's too many transitional moments that you can't manage. You need to be in a different kind of space or a different kind of help, and then you'd flourish. So it's such a delicate kind of working through. Yeah.
It is very delicate. And I think that's one of the reasons that Jo and I are quite interested in what's neurological, what's psychological. Now, Mary, with your daughter, I think it's really interesting. Somebody said to me when I got my diagnosis, what they said was, actually, a diagnosis is only useful if it matches your experience of yourself.
Yeah.
So in some ways, there's probably some mismatch with your daughter's experience of herself and the diagnosis. Or
the funny thing is, she's sort of the poster girl for ADD.
Okay.
She's just become a lawyer, so I mean, she's not stupid, but she's raised 3 children, but she wanders around the world in this sort of bubble all the time. But you're right, she doesn't think of that as ADD. She's also not curious, Jo, about what you said. She's also not curious about why she doesn't, her identity doesn't match, you know, the world. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah.
I liked what you said, Jo, about the crutch, because I think you might be right about that post-diagnosis regression. But also, I think that's what stimulated Jo and I to be talking about what's neurological, what's psychological. You know, our clients come in with a kind of bitterness or a reluctance to take responsibility. Sounds a bit parental, but with you know, a complaint or using it as a crutch. I think it's really fascinating because having an ADHD diagnosis doesn't override all of my psychological history, and that we kind of have to tease out. You've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person, because we have our different psychological mechanisms and different neurotypes. They're all together. So yeah. Okay, we've probably got about 15 minutes left, Jo, so I imagine we're going to need to be selective about those.
Well, shall I ask, actually, is there anything, we've got too much stuff, yeah, because that's our ADHD way. There's always too much of everything. So either I'm really happy that we continue the conversation, or we could just select a couple of slides and just maybe do 2 more slides and call that quits, because I think that might be enough. You'll certainly get the presentation after, so you can look at it in your own time. Does that feel right? Maybe we'll go in, we'll take just 2 slides, we'll have a conversation around it. Yeah, lovely. Okay, let's do that then.
Make a request about the slides, Jo.
Oh yes, go on. Which slides would you like, Steff?
I would like 2 particular slides. I would like the slides with the pile of pennies, the slippery pile.
Oh yeah, great.
And the pile of pennies with the masking.
Oh, fabulous. Let's go back to the pile of pennies stuff then. That's great.
Not very often that's specific about what I want, but there it goes.
There you go. I like it. Okay. So hang on. I may have not got this. Let me get this to the notes one. Hang on. Actually, I'll need it this way. Okay, so let's go to this one.
Yeah, that's it.
Hang on, I've got us wrong. There we go. This one. Okay.
Do you want to start talking to it, Jo, or I start?
No, you start, because I can hear you've got something you want to say. So.
Well, I think what interests me about this particular slide carries on from what we were just saying, really. Like every neurodivergent person every autistic person is different, every ADHD person is different. And so therefore our body minds, or our coping mechanisms are different, being influenced or not by our upbringing culture. So Jo and I talked about what happens to each of us when we get overwhelmed, and then difference in our overwhelm. I can't remember which one you were, Jo.
I was tipping.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. The sense in my body is one of like I'm a bit like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. I could just go, is the internal sensation of, wait, that's too much for me. So, and then there's something about the effort involved in offering myself containment so that I'm not tipping over. But at a physiological level, that's the sensation that my ego states are slippery and in danger of falling over all the time.
And then the experience that I have often, if I'm overwhelmed or I've reached a point where it's just too much, is that I actually feel like I'm disintegrating. So, you know, my pile of pennies might go everywhere and eventually disperse into nothing, which is it's a really frightening place to be. So again, there's a ways that I have now of containing myself or reaching out to others for some containment. Well, my husband, I think, who's probably autistic, undiagnosed, but what happens to him is that the more overwhelmed he gets, the more rigid he gets. So he looks like his pile of pennies are maybe the idealized norm, but it's not, because there's a rigidity to operating that makes it difficult for him and for others. So I was just keen that we kind of showed a range of what, just a very small example, actually a small sample, not example, small sample of a range of experiences of overwhelm. So that's what I wanted to speak to. Was this you wanted to talk about, Jo?
Let's move to the next slide. We'll finish it, and then maybe we could come back as a group and talk some more. Would that be work for you? Yeah, let me just find this next slide. There we go.
Yeah.
I'll begin, shall I? So one of the things that when we were teaching this was that we really, again, wanted people to be, TA people, our community, to be kind of mindful about the kind of facilitating environment that they're going to be offering, whether that's in psychotherapy, counselling, education, or organisationally. Because we were kind of given this metaphor really by an autistic colleague who spoke about, for her, that the difficult part for her was that sometimes her pile of pennies collapses. So when she's in crisis or meltdown, that actually what happens is that her pile of pennies just really falls apart, that it's really difficult for her to hold on to herself. So we were talking about that as a phenomena, and then we were also talking about masking. And the illustrator who did these for us, who's an autistic therapist and illustrator, just beautiful work, she drew this rather gorgeous stack of pennies with a little zip in it. I don't know if you can see the zip. So it's like it's got a normative cover, and there's a little zip, and inside is the neurodivergent being body, and there's this kind of zip, and often there's this kind of tension about trying to kind of mask and pretend to be whatever we might imagine normative looks like in that moment. Anyway, so we kind of wanted to kind of talk about these moments of difficulty, and for us we were particularly talking about how they turn up in the therapy room. Do you want to add some more in, Steff?
So that's beautiful, thank you.
But the Winnicott idea as well is that if a client, I guess, was with us and was always masking, what are we leaving them with if we don't see who they really are, or if contractually we're not in a kind of position to help them be curious about who they really are. And again, this idea from Winnicott about it's a joy to hide, but actually it's a disaster not to be found, we thought really spoke to some of this experience. And even as we say that, Mary, I'm very mindful about that brilliant example of what happens when something's been imposed from the outside and not chosen from the inside. Yeah.
And of your client, Ravia, the joy to be hidden and a disaster not to be found, that in some ways it might have taken that misattuning or something for you to learn about your client's dyslexia. So
yes, of course. Yeah.
It's to be found.
Can I ask, the topic of this webinar was when my okay is not the same as your okay. We've spoken a lot about not feeling okay. Actually, a long sense of I'm not okay. And is this really about helping people get to I'm okay, even in my, is that it's a journey? Because it seems like there's a lot of I'm not okayness with neurodivergent people, and maybe supportive people that help them get to that, but it seems we've spoken a lot about them feeling not okay.
That's, I think we've spoken about the tension between being different and sometimes an imposition to be the same. I think that's what we're talking about. So if we think about the title of my original article was, what if my I'm okay, you're okay is different from yours? So for
The standards by which you would.
yes,
Okay.
for example,
Okay.
I had an intense feeling in my therapy training. Then I was asked to put my feet on the floor and ground myself and get myself in adult. And actually, for me, getting to my place of I'm okay, you're okay was a very different process. So that's
Okay, we agree we're different, and neither is better than the other. It just is different.
Yeah. There is, I think you're right though, aren't you, Rowena? We've ended up in that space talking about the ways in which people have been harmed, I think, by normative culture and an imposition of ideas on people. But I do, there's a bit more in the presentation, which maybe we'll just speak to rather than go back into, where we talk about the gifts, because there's lots of gifts also.
Yeah.
So we
but it's harder for a person with neurodivergence sometimes to get to a point of okayness. It can take harder work, maybe.
I think, yeah, I think
and
that's
support.
been my experience. Yeah. Yeah.
I think I would like to make a little distinction between the philosophy of I'm okay, you're okay, and the experience of I'm okay, and the ability to say I'm okay, you're okay with conviction in one's body, as it were.
Right.
Because I think the value of TA as a theory and the I'm okay, you're okay explicitly says all people are of equal value and equally able to be who they are, whatever that is, and equally worthy of respect. And therefore it goes, I mean, Byrne, when he wrote this, was working with severely psychotic, paranoid, terribly not okay people in terms of the eye of the world. But that's where he developed I'm okay, you're okay, and the okayness of people, no matter how disturbed. So I think for me, it's really important to hold to that. And I think that's different from the internal experience or what we sometimes impose on each other around, I don't feel okay, or I feel more okay. And I think for many people in therapy, and not necessarily for all sorts of reasons, neurodivergence or whatever, it's a long journey to come to a really secure sense of I'm okay, you're okay, as an experience. Just wanted to say that.
right. Yeah, that's great. Ravia?
Hi, I just wanted to say that I see, for me, the big problem is not in the individual as much as it's in the system.
Absolutely.
Like how we view them. So a lot of society views somebody who's different as not okay, rather than the person thinking I'm not okay. And that applies to a lot of other things, a lot
Absolutely.
of racism,
Exactly.
religion, I mean, you name it. A lot of things fall under that umbrella. So I see it as understanding how our brain works. And it's as simple as that. There's nothing wrong, right? It's understanding yourself and how your brain works. And I do it with myself. If I want to post a letter tomorrow, I have to do two things. Either I put a reminder in my phone, or I have to have the letter visible. If either of these are not there, I'm not going to post a letter. So the fact that I understand that that's how my brain works helps me. So it's just about understanding yourself, really. Like you said, who are you? It's finding that for yourself.
Yeah.
And there's nothing not okay about it.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's helpful, Diane, for you to remind us of the definition of really what okayness is. I think that is helpful. And I suppose it's the worthiness of respect, because I would imagine for some people who I don't know, certainly I have a husband who's had a head injury, and you go to a doctor's room and they talk almost as if the person isn't there, is in a sense a communication of not okayness in another way. Be an example, I suppose.
I just want to say, Ravi, I really like your point. I think lots of what we're talking about as what has ended up being internalized, that is really aspects of systemic social organization, and these overly prescriptive ideas about normativity, and of course race, class, gender, disability, all kinds of things all coming together as well. And that is the really interesting thing for all of us, isn't it? How can we be okay if maybe society thinks we're not okay? Yeah. And how do we recover from that? How do we reclaim ourselves in the light of a system that doesn't welcome us or approve of us or thinks that we're different in multiple different ways? So I really like where you've gone. Thank you for that. Yeah.
And I think we're just about coming up to the...
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, I'm going to have to go.
I am too, I'm afraid.
I'm very lovely to see you again after all this time.
It was good to see you too, Diane. And thank you all. This was just wonderful.
What a gorgeous photo. Thank you, everybody, from me too. Appreciate it very much.
Just terrific. Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Rowena.
Bye.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
So that's us done, Andrew, Marguerite.
We've got Ravia, and that's great. I think.
Thank you both so much for a really interesting presentation and discussion. And thank you so much for being with us and our tiny little South African TA association.
Yeah, and I'm really sorry we had so few people, because quite often we have people from India or other places keying in, because although we're small here, it's open to people from anywhere to come to any of these.
Yeah.
And if they're willing to cough up a little bit of money, which is not a lot in rand terms. So I certainly hope we can make the most of, well, it will be on the website, I assume, Andrew, if everybody agrees. And let's put it out there, and let's, tell people about it. Where they
might be the time of year. I don't know about you are, but in Holland in August, everyone is on holiday.
Yeah,
that's
true. Very much so.
Most of Europe.
No.
Thank you very much.
Just so again, another thanks from SCTA to Steff and Jo for taking the time to come and present to us, and also to Diane, Rawia, and Mary and Rowena, who was here. It's been really lovely experience. I think what you said right in the beginning about the importance of walking your talk really shone through our time together. So thank you, and look forward to being able to engage with you guys at some stage, and being able to share this through our platform.
Thank you.
It's lovely.
Andrew. Andrew and I are learning Welsh. He's more advanced than I am. But...
Okay.
Thank you very much,
everybody. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.